Picture this, the roar of a stadium, a nation's dreams riding on a single game. Now imagine that final whistle, not signaling the end, but the beginning of something far darker. This is the story of the only time in history a soccer match directly ignited a real shooting war. Tanks, warplanes, and soldiers all mobilized over a World Cup qualifier. This isn't an allegory. This is the raw history of the 100-hour war, better known as the Football War. A conflict that proved the line between sport and warfare can vanish in an instant. To understand how we got here, we need to look at the two neighbors at the center of our story, El Salvador and Honduras. On one hand, you have Honduras, the larger country, with more than 5 times the territory of its neighbor, but with just 2.6 million people in 1969. And on the other, El Salvador, tiny, but packed with 3.7 million citizens. That's 40% more people in a fraction of the space. This population pressure had been building for decades. By 1969, more than 300,000 Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras looking for land and work. That meant Salvadoran immigrants made up more than 10% of Honduras's entire population. For years, this arrangement worked well enough. Salvadorans found opportunity. Honduran landowners got cheap labor. But tensions were simmering beneath the surface. In Honduras, most of the land was controlled by a powerful few. Just 8.8% of landowners held over 63% of the land. The wealthy created pressure groups, and they began pointing fingers at the Salvadoran immigrants as the source of their problems. Then came the game changer. In 1962, Honduras passed a new land reform law. By 1967, it was being fully enforced, and it specifically targeted lands occupied by Salvadoran immigrants. The law allowed the government to seize property from both immigrant farmers and squatters, regardless of their claims to ownership or how long they'd been there. The land would be redistributed to native-born Hondurans. The result was devastating. Thousands of Salvadoran laborers were expelled from Honduras, their lives and livelihoods destroyed in an instant. Families who had lived in Honduras for generations were suddenly homeless and heading back to an already overcrowded El Salvador. The stage was set for explosion. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in June 1969, in the form of a 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier, a two-leg playoff that would become perhaps the deadliest soccer match in history. The chapter headed by the match was held in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, on June 8th. The Salvadoran team reported being harassed by Honduran fans at their hotel the night before the game. Honduras won 1-0, and reports claimed Salvadoran fans set fire to the stadium in frustration. The tension was just beginning. The second match was scheduled for San Salvador, El Salvador, just 1 week later. This time, the Honduran team got the hostile treatment. Salvadoran fans rioted outside their hotel, leading to several deaths. At the match itself, instead of the Honduran flag, a dirty rag was raised. El Salvador won 3-0. But the real chaos erupted back in Honduras. Anti-Salvadoran riots swept the country following the loss. Salvadoran immigrants and their businesses were targeted in violent attacks. El Salvador would later claim that around 12,000 Salvadorans were forced to flee Honduras in the days following the match. On June 26th, the night before the playoff match in Mexico City, El Salvador took the drastic step of dissolving all diplomatic ties with Honduras, accusing the Honduran government of permitting genocide against Salvadoran citizens. Meanwhile, along the border, skirmishes were already breaking out. Salvadoran anti-aircraft fire targeted a civilian plane, and both sides were exchanging mortar fire. The soccer rivalry had escalated into something far more dangerous. On the field, El Salvador won the playoff match 3-2 after extra time, earning their spot in the World Cup. But off the field, they were preparing for a very different kind of contest. At around 6 p.m. on July 14, 1969, the Salvadoran military launched their attack. The football war had officially begun.
The Salvadoran Air Force struck first, attacking Honduran airfields using World War II-era P-51 Mustangs. They even converted civilian aircraft into makeshift bombers. Their main target, Toncontín International Airport, where the Honduran Air Force kept half its aircraft. On the ground, Salvadoran troops launched a two-front invasion. One contingent headed toward the prosperous Sula Valley, while the other marched along the Pan American Highway toward the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa. Initial progress was shockingly swift. One Salvadoran newspaper claimed they advanced 40 kilometers in a single day. Honduras retaliated with their own World War II-era aircraft, F-4U Corsairs, bombing Salvadoran oil facilities and destroying 20% of El Salvador's fuel reserves. But this would become known as the last conflict in history where piston-engined fighters would dogfight against each other, a final echo of World War II playing out in Central American skies. The war's major battle occurred when Salvadoran troops surrounded and captured the town of Nueva Ocotepeque. But soon, the Salvadoran advance stalled. Due to ammunition shortages and strengthening Honduran resistance, in just 4 days, the conflict had already claimed thousands of lives. With both nations bleeding and the conflict stalemated, the Organization of American States intervened, negotiating a ceasefire that took effect on the night of July 18th, just about 100 hours after it began. Hence its other name, the 100-Hour War. El Salvador initially resisted withdrawing its troops, demanding guarantees for Salvadorans still in Honduras. But after the OAS threatened economic sanctions, Salvadoran forces finally pulled back on August 2nd. The status quo was restored, but the human cost was staggering. At least 4,000 people dead, the majority of them civilians. And here's where our story takes its first twist. Because while everyone calls it the football war, the soccer match wasn't really the cause. The truth is, the war had been brewing for years over land disputes, immigration policies, and economic tensions. The soccer match was merely the trigger, the final spark that lit a fuse that was already laid. The governments on both sides used the nationalist frenzy around the games to divert attention from their own domestic problems. But the second, more profound twist is this. The football war, though brief, had catastrophic long-term consequences that far outstripped those 4 days of fighting. The war caused the 22-year suspension of the Central American Common Market, devastating both economies. Most significantly, it exacerbated the social and political tensions in El Salvador that would erupt just 1 decade later into the brutal Salvadoran Civil War, a conflict that would last 12 years and claim at least 75,000 lives. As for the soccer, El Salvador made it to the 1970 World Cup, but lost all their matches without scoring a single goal. A disappointing performance for a team that had fought so hard to qualify. The real victory wouldn't be found on any scoreboard, but in the painful lessons learned about what can happen when sports rivalry crosses the line into nationalist violence. So what's the real lesson of the football war? It's that the boundaries we draw between sport and politics, between games and life and death conflict, are far thinner than we'd like to believe. A soccer match didn't cause this war, but it provided the perfect excuse, the nationalist fervor, the final push that turned simmering tensions into open warfare.
Today, Honduras and El Salvador maintain peaceful relations, with a peace treaty finally signed in 1980. The border disputes that helped spark the conflict were eventually settled by the International Court of Justice in 1992. But the memory of those 4 days in July 1969 serves as a permanent warning, a reminder that sports, for all their beauty and passion, can sometimes become dangerous weapons in the wrong hands. What's your verdict? Can you imagine modern sports rivalries escalating to this level? Let us know in the comments. If you found this story of how a soccer match sparked a real war fascinating, you'll want to watch our next video, The Pig War, how a pig nearly started WW1. Make sure to subscribe to the Records Revealed for more deep dives into the forgotten, bizarre, and shocking true stories of our past.